Так, добрый вечер, дорогие друзья. Добро пожаловать на наш семинар по факультету международных отношений Университета Вестминстера. С нами сегодня на связи прямо из Лондона доктор Грег Ассен, который расскажет о чем он нас расскажет? Он проводит презентацию на тему Афганистана. Это какая-то сложная история. В общем, посмотрите сами. Ну и, конечно же, вы можете задавать ваши вопросы в чате. Очень, пожалуйста, welcome. В конце выступления Грега, и он на них на все ответит. Для тех из вас, кому интересно побольше узнать о самом университете или кому нужна персональная помощь в подборе учебной программы, мы всегда рады провести личную консультацию с кем-то из наших специалистов или организовать встречу с представителем университета. Итак, передаю слово Грегу. Greg, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, cool. Well, let me just share my screen so you can see the presentation. Cool, hope that works. Make it big. Beautiful. Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Yeah, my name is Dr. Greg Asen. I'm a lecturer at the University of Westminster in Politics, International Relations. And I wanted to talk a bit about Afghanistan today and really kind of map out the significance of the country going forward for regional powers such as China and India. Now, this is partly because of the audience. I know that Russia has been and continues to be heavily involved in Afghanistan and where that country is going. So I thought that it would be interesting, at least for you guys to hear, but also because Afghanistan has this perhaps uncanny ability really to tell us where the global order is moving, okay? And a lot of the historical developments that have taken place over the last century and a half, or century and a quarter rather, geopolitical movements rather, have had some significance placed on Afghanistan, okay? So I wanted to talk about Afghanistan in the context of a changing global order. Now, also, I mean, as a caveat, something else that we need to keep in mind is that as the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan, we don't really know what this is going to look like going forward, you know, say in the next 4 years with the Biden administration. This is going to potentially leave a power vacuum, right? So regional players such as China and India, but also Russia, Iran, have a particular stake in the country. So I wanted to take this time just to do a brief overview of what these stakes are and really maybe make a few projections as to where things are going. So in terms of structure, I'm going to start off by just giving a brief background on Afghanistan. I mean, I know that some people will know a bit about Afghanistan, others won't. So I wanted to introduce the country through perhaps a series of images. I usually like to introduce Afghanistan in this way because it's well known, it's a well-recognized country, but there's a lot of different dynamics. So I'm going to give a brief survey of different interpretations and different representations of Afghanistan in the global order. After that, I'm going to talk a bit about the United States. Obviously, the US is rolling back their involvement in the country, but the reasons for why the US got involved in the first place and how they approached Afghanistan through development is quite telling in terms of how this country becomes emblematic of the great causes of the world and great antagonisms of the world. Then I'm going to shift focus and spend a bit of time talking about China's Afghanistan strategy. And I'm going to boil that down to 3 main factors. So looking at diplomacy with soft power, looking at economic investment, and looking at security. And following that, I'm going to do basically the same approach, but look at India's Afghanistan strategy and basically look at, okay, what are the similarities between India and China, but what is India really trying to gain from Afghanistan, and is this even possible? Because, I mean, when we think about major players in the region, we generally tend to think of countries like Russia or countries like China. But India has always been heavily involved in the redevelopments and the rebuilding of Afghanistan. So it's interesting to look at what their goals are with that in mind. And at the end, I mean, I'm going to stick around for questions, so please feel free to, make this as interactive as you like. So starting with the beginning. Afghanistan. When I introduce Afghanistan, hang on, let me see. I hope you can't see that bit. Yeah, so when I introduce Afghanistan, I usually start off by highlighting its location, its place. And indeed, this is why the country has been, or one of the major reasons why Afghanistan has been so significant to great powers over the centuries, its location. Now, it sounds a bit of like a cliche, and maybe it is, but Afghanistan is commonly referred to as the center of Asia, the heart of Asia, the seat of Asia, the world's cockpit. That's my favorite. And basically, this is to highlight that it is really at a crossroads, geographically speaking, but also culturally, where Central Asia meets South Asia, or East Asia meets West Asia. And its location, despite being landlocked, is very significant, historically speaking, but also contemporarily speaking. Because the idea is, if you have control over this territory, geopolitically speaking, you can springboard into 4 different regions. Now, with the exception of Iran, I really can't think of another country off the top of my head that has such a significant geography. But also, getting to this notion of a crossroads, this is also pretty significant because within the country itself, there's a lot of division. In the north, around the border of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, there's heavy Central Asian influences. Okay, and predominantly the population is Uzbek. In the south, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but along the Pashtun belt, so this south and west Afghanistan, sorry, and east Afghanistan rather, it's predominantly Pashtun, okay, with links to South Asia. If we look to West Afghanistan, around cities like Herat, these are heavily influenced by Persian culture. Now, all of this is to say, and in the middle, in central Afghanistan, you also have Hazara. Now, all of this is to say that to create a unified Afghan national identity is very, very difficult. And so despite its central location, it's also a very fractured geography, both in terms of the actual geography itself, but also in terms of culture and history. So this is the first main significance and the first way of understanding the country. Now, secondly, Afghanistan is commonly referred to as a victim, okay? And this is very, very unfortunate for Afghans themselves because this deprives them of their own self-representation, their own I guess, global sense of identity, because the rest of the world, because of geopolitical movements and the tragedy that has been Afghanistan since 1978/79, the world sees Afghanistan as a victim of the great antagonisms facing the world today. Okay, so I mean, from the Western perspective, I mean, I'm not American. We can just do that disclaimer right now. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm Canadian, but from a Western perspective, looking, I guess, growing up, we were always confronted with Afghans as victims of Soviet aggression. Okay, and this is clearly referring to the Soviet-Afghan War. After the fall of the Cold War, Afghans are referred to as victims of Islamic fundamentalism, largely because of warring Mujahideen factions, but also because of the Taliban. In the contemporary period, depending on your politics, Afghanistan and Afghans are represented as victims of Western aggression and US imperialism, as we've seen with the war on terror and the war on drugs and the ongoing occupation there. So common in all of these is this representation of Afghans as a victim, but also a victim of a global other, okay? This antagonistic force that seems to change from generation to generation. And this is very significant because it leads into yet another representation of the country, Afghanistan as a cause, okay? Because despite this consistent representation of Afghans as victims and of, I guess, this perpetual link towards victimhood, this is not, or has not really stopped the international community from propping up Afghanistan as its own, unique cause. Okay, its own potential for realizing its unique vision of the world. And we'll see this when I talk about the United States, but we'll also see this when I'm referring to China and India. So essentially what happens is Afghanistan becomes this blank slate, okay, where the Afghans themselves are deprived of a voice that the international community listens to. And again, this is one of the great tragedies of the contemporary political situation, but also a situation where the great powers are looking to Afghanistan to build a new international system or a new political order in their own desired image. So the best example of this, of course, which I'll expand on a little bit in a moment, is how the US has approached state building in that country. Of course, if we go back in time to the turn of the 21st century, the failed state discourse in international relations was one of the most prominent, one of the most significant, right? So the idea behind the invasion of Afghanistan was to build a strong, stable, centralized government in that country. But of course, how this changed over time was also reflective of different administrations in the United States. And ultimately, as the US is attempting to cut and run, I mean, this is at least my interpretation of events, we're seeing perhaps new stakeholders such as China and India approaching Afghanistan as their own unique cause, okay, for either state building or in terms of upsetting the regional order itself. And I guess to kind of add to this as well, one of the real knock-on effects, if we could say it, about Afghanistan and this emphasis on Afghanistan as a cause has been to create this development class, okay? There is something incredibly lucrative about developing Afghanistan that we haven't really seen in other countries to that extent. I mean, at the top of the slide here, I say that there's $100 billion in aid alone since 2002. Really, it's probably much more than that. This is just emergency aid, right? Now, the reality, though, is that after 18 years, or I guess 19 years, there's my math skills, 19 years of development in Afghanistan, a majority of the population is still suffering from poverty. So what does this tell you? This tells you that a lot of the regional powers are much more interested in using the country itself as a means to an end globally. And the last image that I want to at least discuss in introducing Afghanistan is to, I guess, highlight that it is a regional actor, an important regional actor at that. Now, you might think, okay, this is obvious, but unfortunately, this is very much overlooked because of these dominant tropes of representing Afghanistan and Afghans as victims. I mean, let me put it this way. Afghanistan, yes, its geography is, one of its strong suits, but it also exists in one of the most volatile neighborhoods in the international system, okay? It is surrounded by powerful countries, whereas Afghanistan suffers from chronic underdevelopment. They share a border with Pakistan, India, so there's that rivalry, Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, but also Russia's in the neighborhood, China's in the neighborhood, and of course the United States has a presence at this point in that neighborhood, okay? So there's a lot of geopolitical rivalries there. And so in order to avoid Afghanistan being this eternal or perpetual victim, the Ghani administration, so the National Unity Government, and now with Ashraf Ghani, having somewhat consolidated more power, has been attempting to integrate Afghanistan into the regional system. Okay, and we've seen this through the utilization of regional forums such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Heart of Asia Istanbul process, and the Munich Security Conference, which isn't a regional forum, more of a global forum. But what this has done, or I guess the objective really from the Afghan side, is to promote the country as this frontline state, okay? A country that is facing the major antagonisms, the major challenges of the world, and is not just this passive victim, but rather a clear partner. And I want you, if you're listening, to keep this in mind, because when we look at China's foreign policy, we're going to find a clear connection between the Afghan government's emphasis on multilateral institutions and also China's emphasis on bolstering these multilateral institutions. So what have we got? I mean, if we needed to narrow down the dominant feature, or I guess the consistent feature for Afghanistan moving forward, we can consider location to be of primary importance, okay? And this is a little bit reductive, but hear me out. The reason why location is important is because despite Afghans and Afghanistan trying to just focus on itself and develop and I guess from a government perspective to create a common sense of identity, other countries, great powers in the region, but even great powers in the world, are obsessed with it, okay? And the reason, of course, is down to location. And this goes way back to the 19th century with the Great Game between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. I mean, for the Russian Empire, they were trying to move or expand southwards towards South Asia to gain access to the lucrative spice trade. For the British, they were afraid of Russian imperialism and wanted to expand further north to basically ward off any expansion from the Russians into South Asia. But common in all of this are the Afghans caught in the middle. Okay, now ultimately the British tried 3 times now, I guess 4 if you include the War on Terror, but maybe not, to establish control over Afghanistan. They haven't been able to, and this is why the country is referred to as the graveyard of empires. But this common emphasis on location, geopolitical significance, didn't just end with the Age of Empires, but also continued through the Second World War, with Nazi Germany trying to use Afghanistan as a jumping off point, either to invade Central Asia, against the Soviet Union, or to invade British India. So again, the emphasis is on location. And this continues even further into the Cold War. I mean, Afghanistan, I'm sure many of you know, but Afghanistan was one of the major ideological battlegrounds, okay, up until the Tsar Revolution. For the USSR, the Soviet Union, they were heavily investing in enhancing the military capacity of Afghanistan, but also the industrial capacity and infrastructure projects as well, but primarily military and industry. And this is part of this, Soviet development playbook. For the United States and Western donors, in a broader sense, they were more focused on economic development and big infrastructure projects like hydroelectric dams. Now, what does this mean for Afghans themselves? Well, this is actually quite telling in terms of understanding how the political establishment in the country has tried to balance, really, between these great power ambitions. And this is something known as the Bitarafi policy, which I have down on the bottom here, which basically refers to balancing between great powers. So take the Cold War, for example, rather than siding with one country or the other, which inevitably did happen after the Tsar Revolution, but initially, rather than siding with, say, the US over the Soviet Union or vice versa, the idea was to play them off of each other. Because one of the harsh realities of Afghanistan politically is that because of the, for lack of a better word, historical baggage of invasions and hardship and foreign meddling, being too close to a foreign power is, as we'd say in English, grabbing the third rail politically. You just don't do it, okay? So this policy of balancing great powers one off of each other is an important continuity that we should all be aware of as the US is scaling back and as Afghanistan is confronting its neighborhood without the US as the major security guarantor. So with that brief introduction, I want to turn now to the United States, okay, and their exit strategy, if we can even call it that. It's such a big question mark right now with the US that, it's difficult to really predict what the Biden administration is going to offer. But it's interesting to look at the United States too in retrospect, because I'm sure we're all of a different age here, but I remember very vividly when the US first went in. And to put that in the context of, say, 2001, the US was the sole superpower at that time, okay? It had the ability to remake the world, or at least attempt to remake the world in its own desired image, although not playing by the same rules. Russia was starting to rebuild its economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China had not really taken off economically yet, although the writing was on the wall. And Iran was still somewhat isolated back then. Now, to contrast that with today, it's really interesting to see just how the US has declined relative to its position in Afghanistan. So I wanted to look first, though, at why the US went into Afghanistan in the first place, okay? Because this might give us some indication of how the US has approached that country, but also the role that Afghanistan has played in the 21st century. So as I said, the US is, I guess, more reflective of a twilight superpower these days, right? They're not dominating the world like they used to, and in fact, they're trying to scale back. But initially, the US went into Afghanistan to satisfy, I think it can be boiled down to three main reasons, okay? Security, economics, and expansionism. Now, when it comes to security, this is probably the most open and shut, isn't it? I mean, if we think in the context of 9/11, Al-Qaeda was given safe haven in Afghanistan under the Taliban. The US had been negotiating with the Taliban prior to try and get Al-Qaeda kicked out of Afghanistan, and even better, maybe surrender Osama bin Laden. This obviously didn't work. And as soon as 9/11 happened, the US had an idea of where Osama bin Laden was. And turns out Iran actually said where a lot of the Taliban leadership and Al-Qaeda was. That's a fun fact. And the US went in. Okay, so the idea was to rid the world of Al-Qaeda, to defeat the Taliban, and to establish a pro-US and a stable democracy in South, Central, West/East Asia. Now, why didn't they leave? Ask yourself that. Why didn't the US leave? Because if we go back in time to 2002, 2003, things were relatively stable, okay? The Taliban were gone. I mean, they weren't destroyed, but they were in Pakistan, okay? They fled. The US and US partners within the country had authority. So why didn't they leave? Well, the answer to that is really quite indicative of the United States' long-term strategy, because what happened is the rationale, really, the security rationale morphed away from purely counterterrorism to also include things like counter-narcotics, counterinsurgency, inevitably, stopping transnational criminal organizations, human trafficking, all of these things. So remember what I said before about Afghanistan being the cause. From a security perspective, and from the perspective of the United States, Afghanistan morphed into an endless stream of concept wars, okay? Which by definition can't really be won, but are more of a projection of power. Now, economically speaking, or in terms of economics rather, Afghanistan, and I'll expand on this in a minute, but one of the great ironies, and again, I'm using this frequently, but one of the great tragedies of Afghanistan is that it is one of the richest countries in the world, okay? In terms of gems, in terms of natural gas, oil, timber, minerals, precious metals, all of these things are in Afghanistan in abundance. But the tragedy is because of instability and because of ongoing insecurity and lack of infrastructure, or really problems with infrastructure, it's not really viable to extract these resources or to build a industry in the country. So the US got involved, or at least initially for security concerns, but this morphed or snowballed into economic interests. And the idea was that the United States, which surveyed every inch of that country for resources, was going to partner with the Afghan government to build a robust resource sector. Now, ultimately, this hasn't been realized because of ongoing insecurity, but this is one of the factors. And something else worth mentioning, I don't know if anyone's ever worked in development or worked in development in Afghanistan before, but what we've seen with neoliberalism and the Bush, but also Obama administration to state building and to counterterrorism, development itself became a very lucrative industry. So of that $100 billion that went into Afghanistan since 2002, a very large part of that money was just siphoned right back out again through lucrative contracts with foreign contractors and foreign experts and so on and so forth. So sustaining a presence in Afghanistan also had real clear economic reasons. But lastly, and again, I'll expand on this in a minute, but there is the expansionist arguments as well. When you think about it, again, this is down to location, but the geopolitical rivalry that was, on the cards for the US vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Russia, Afghanistan offered a real solution, or a real I guess a necessary tool really for the US to confront and contain, in the case of China, these powers. Because think about it, Afghanistan, yes, despite only having a 76 kilometer kilometer border with China gives access, at least in terms of air power, from the US, if they have air bases in Afghanistan, to Western China. For Iran, this allows US to invade through the back door, whereas invading from Iraq to Iran is virtually impossible. And in terms of Russia, clearly Russia doesn't share a border with Afghanistan, but to maintain a constant presence on the periphery or in the neighborhood of Russia is and remains one of the key objectives of the United States. So establishing this foothold in Central Asia, or Central Asia, wherever you want to place Afghanistan, was seen as a real necessary step in terms of projecting, or some might say expanding, US interests. So how did they do it? Well, I mean, this is one of the major questions, right? How did the US realize or attempt to realize this goal of, ridding the world of terror, ridding the world of drugs, and establishing this foothold? Well, it's interesting to look at it through the lens of development, okay? And you might think, okay, well, that's kind of weird, because why wouldn't the most powerful military, I mean, this is what they always say, the most powerful military that there ever was, why couldn't they just impose their will on the Afghan people? Well, part of this is down to the question of how do you win a concept war? How do you defeat terrorism? Can you? Not really. It's an ideology, or essentially a use of violence to fit an ideological purpose. How do you defeat drugs in a war on drugs? Well, you can't, because they're substances, inanimate objects, right? You have to ingest drugs. So you can't really just spray opium or poppy fields in the hopes that, okay, we're done the war on drugs now. So instead, what the US did, and not just the US, but ISAF, so International Security Assistance Force, which has now been disbanded, what they initially did is they linked development projects to counterinsurgency. So the idea here was any development project, whether or not it's building this humble bridge here, which I have on the slide, or building a well, or building a hydroelectric dam, this was linked with the counterinsurgency operations. And I guess the utility, or the goal really of this approach, was to win over the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. I mean, this is fundamentally the most important, but also to demonstrate the legitimacy of the Afghan government. So in terms of state building, in terms of ridding Afghanistan from terrorist groups and Islamic fundamentalism and whatever else the US had as their agenda at that moment, development was seen as a necessary step, or really a vital tool in achieving this goal. Okay, now did this work? In hindsight, no, not at all. The reason being is that a lot of these development projects were placed in high insurgency areas, so hot areas, in Helmand and Kandahar and the like. And because of this, and also because of links to the Afghan government, these targets, or these development projects, were open season. So there was legitimacy for the Taliban to attack them, to attack these development projects. So ultimately it didn't work. But what this tells us, though, or this does tell us a lot about how the US really attempted to build Afghanistan from the ground up as a way of, again, projecting power into Central Asia, ridding the war of drugs, terrorism, organized crime, you name it, but also to benefit economically. Now, another good example of this is to look at state building, okay? And this translates back to what I was saying before about Afghanistan being a particular cause, okay? So the United States, from the very beginning, they were focused on rebuilding Afghanistan in their own desired image. So what does this mean exactly? Well, the idea was that Afghanistan would be this stable democracy in Central Asia that could be relied upon. Now, how do you realize this goal? Well, it's interesting actually to compare the Bush administration's initial approach, which ironically, because they were neoconservative and heavily indoctrinated with neoliberalism, what they first did is they focused on a top-down approach to state building. So building strong state institutions like a justice system, I guess a formal justice system, building a strong military and security apparatus. All of these things were focused on by the Bush administration. Now, inevitably, this didn't really work out well because of ongoing corruption, lack of government accountability, and really I guess, localism or local politics in rural Afghanistan. Now, the Obama administration, when they come in, is they flip it on its head, and they, I guess, they employ more of a bottom-up approach, which translates to cultivating a robust civil society. Now, what does this mean in reality? Well, essentially, we have two conflicting visions, right? One premised on a strong state, one premised on a strong culture and society, and they cancel each other out. So a really good example of this is actually a project that I worked on when I was in Afghanistan years ago on justice linkages, okay? And what this project showed us is that, yes, despite all this money going into building a formal justice system, most Afghans don't trust it, okay? Because it's plagued by corruption, inaccessibility, and a lack of accountability. Whereas instead, a local justice system, or even sometimes a shadow justice system employed or operated by the Taliban, was seen as the better means of resolving disputes, okay, resolving civil disputes, and even criminal disputes for that matter. And so what this tells us is that the US essentially used Afghanistan as this test, as this test site, really, for its own visions of state building going forward. Because if we think back in the context of why the US got involved initially in Afghanistan, this was largely driven by the failed state discourse. But in reality, and the last thing I want to say about state building, though, and this links back to economics, the reality is that a lot of these state building exercises were conducted by private enterprises, okay? So private contractors, NGOs, and so on and so forth. So why I'm saying this, and really kind of how this factors into the United States strategies initially for going into Afghanistan, is that this allowed, in a way, foreign donors, not just the United States, but Turkey, Germany, UK, France, even humble Canada, it allowed these countries to, in a way, recoup their losses, okay? Because foreign experts, I mean, I worked for an Afghan NGO, so I wasn't really a foreign expert in that regard, but foreign experts who are based in Kabul were paid lucrative sums of money. Development contracts were, I guess, had inflated budgets, if we can say, and this allowed money to be funneled out of Afghanistan to places like the UAE, London, and so on and so forth, right? So this is actually, state building becomes almost an industry in Afghanistan. And lastly, for the United States, but also for global powers, there was development to exploit resources. And this gets back to what I was saying about economics. As I said, Afghanistan is incredibly rich. The irony or the problem, though, is it's way too unstable to be able to extract these resources. So what the US, but also what foreign powers did, is they essentially planted seeds in Afghanistan, so forgive the expression. But what they did is they planted seeds hoping to corner certain areas of the market so that when Afghanistan becomes a stable country in the future, so whenever that may be, in 10, 15 years, hopefully, or hopefully next year, when Afghanistan becomes stable, then these countries have control over certain sectors. Okay, so as we'll see with China, they largely cornered the copper market. Canada was trying to corner gemstone mining. India was trying to corner the iron ore market. And the US was trying to position itself as this arbitrator. Okay, now, again, the irony is that this hasn't really been realized yet. And indeed, a lot of these resource contracts come with conditionalities and so on and so forth, you know, that are linked to state building. But the hope here from the US, but also the international community, was to rebuild Afghanistan and to place their interest in terms of resources and economic growth at the heart of their involvement. Okay? So with that in mind, let's turn to China. And I just want you guys to, whoever's listening, I want you to think, okay, well, what does China really have to gain in Afghanistan? I've mapped out so far that Afghanistan is, I guess, suffering from weak government institutions, widespread insecurity. What does China have to gain? Well, and I guess here's maybe something that I should have mentioned before. One of the things, though, about China is you never really hear Afghanistan at the top of their foreign policy. When it comes to China and India, they're usually more focused on adversaries. So India is more focused on its relations with its South Asian neighbors, most notably Pakistan. China is more focused on its global ambitions, but also countering what they see as US containment. So where does Afghanistan factor in? Well, despite this big question mark, China does have a lot to gain in Afghanistan, and they have been actively seeking out a larger role really in the country. So basically what it boils down to in terms of what China has to gain, we can narrow it down to 3 factors, okay? So first is soft power and diplomatic gains, okay? And this is what I'm going to talk about now. Secondly is economic gains, okay? And I'll expand on that in a minute. And lastly is security. So when it comes to diplomacy, since 2000, so since the turn of the 21st century, there has been this discourse coming out of China about a peaceful rise. And this is largely because of US/Western concerns about what a re-emerging China will look like. Okay, is China going to upset the balance of power in the global order? Are they going to rewrite the rules of the international system? The West seems to be obsessed with China in this regard. And China is quite aware of that. So think about it this way. You've got Afghanistan here, countries that has been in a perpetual state of war since the late 1970s, okay? So over 40 years now. No one's been able to solve it. No one's been able to bring a lasting or sustainable peace. And here you have China that is trying to boost its credentials of being this, benevolent great power and an honest broker. So China has been really championing this idea in Afghanistan and really testing it out to demonstrate that it is a responsible power. It is an honest broker, and it's not really defined by the same type of imperialism that the US has come to represent, really. And the way that China has done this, I guess, is twofold. So the first thing to understand, the doctrine of China is really driven by this notion of non-interference, okay? Whereas the US and Western countries are generally vilified for interfering in other countries' affairs, and so on and so forth. For China, it's more premised on this notion of, okay, well, we just want to enter into a win-win partnership. So with this in mind, what China has done is they have really used multilateral institutions, so such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to further integrate A, Afghanistan's position in the regional order, and B, to demonstrate that China is there to come up with a peaceful solution, really, for Afghanistan itself, but also to integrate Afghanistan into the regional order. Now, what this looks like in reality is China is, I wouldn't say that they're playing both sides, but they are open to negotiations with the Taliban and with the government of Afghanistan. And indeed, they have had, at least at first time, secret, but then back-channel talks with the Taliban based in Xinjiang, so in Western China, okay? But again, at the heart of this is this notion that China is an honest mediator, whereas other countries in the region, such as the US, even India, which has interests vis-a-vis Pakistan, even Russia, China is unique in that it is really just there as a good neighbor that is trying to resolve the ongoing crisis and conflict in the country. Now, the next would, of course, be economic interest, but again, because of the shortcomings and the challenges that I highlighted before, China hasn't really been able to realize its own economic objectives yet, okay? But that's not to say that they're not focused on it, okay, and thinking in terms of 10 or 20 years from now. Now, it's important to know that China's economy and economic growth is really one of the main factors of domestic stability. Now, the Communist Party of China does have, it does have legitimacy, it has a lot of authority. However, the thing with the Communist Party is it's essentially put all of its eggs into one basket, that is economic growth, right? Now, with the level of economic growth that the Chinese populace has become used to, this requires an almost insatiable appetite for resources. Now, Afghanistan has plenty of them. So what China has done is it has attempted to corner certain areas of the market, so such as the copper deposit at Ainak, which we'll talk about in a minute, in the hopes that once stability is brought to Afghanistan, then they will have access to these resources, okay? Now, of course, the shortcoming is down to insecurity. So the image that I have here on the slide, this is of Ainak copper mine. So this is the second largest copper deposit in the world. Okay, the Chinese have the lease, currently have the lease for the rights to mine in that deposit. But despite having that lease for, it might be almost a decade now, despite having that lease, they haven't been able to extract any of the resources. Partly this is down to insecurity. Actually, perhaps unfortunately from a Chinese perspective, they also discovered a archaeological site there. So that's what that image is of on the slide there. But what this tells you is that China has all of these goals, these ambitions to build a railway connecting to Western China, to exploiting all these resources, or I guess extracting all these resources rather, to building pipelines, all of these projects, but they all hinge on stability. Okay, and it's quite telling that despite the Belt and Road Initiative being this global game changer, it has largely and only very recently begun to include Afghanistan. And again, this is because of the ongoing insurgency. So what does this amount to then? And I guess if I had to pick a dominant feature when it came to China's interest in Afghanistan, I would focus on security itself, okay? But not global security, but rather domestic security. Now, part of this is more historical than anything, okay? So during the Taliban regime, the East Turkestan independence movement, so the Uyghur separatist group, had a safe haven in Afghanistan, mostly in Badakhshan province. So again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the northeast. Now, they had been in negotiation with the Taliban to deprive the ETIM of free movements in Afghanistan, but with the ouster of the Taliban in 2001, it became a moot point. Now, the fear, though, is if the Taliban does take control of Afghanistan again, the fear is that East Turkestan independence movement will again have a safe haven. There's also the issue of narcotics trafficking. I mean, Afghanistan is the center of the global heroin trade, both in terms of production, but also processing now. And despite, a relatively small amount getting into China, it still is a major factor, okay? So security is one of the major focuses of China. Now, the crazy thing, though, is, well, it's not even crazy. From a Chinese perspective, the main limitation, though, is that China has no desire, zero desire whatsoever to get involved in Afghanistan, militarily or otherwise. I mean, A, that goes against the Chinese brand, but B, I mean, it's right next door. I mean, they've seen how the British Empire really crumbled or started to reach really its limitations in Afghanistan, how the Soviet Union crumbled after Afghanistan, and how the US is in a clear decline after Afghanistan, right? So China has no desire. So basically, their approach to Afghanistan rests on three factors. First, hedging between Kabul and the Taliban. This is really reflective in dialogue and inter-Afghan dialogue that has been facilitated by China between the two groups, because again, no one really knows what's going to happen next year. There's a lot of speculation, but will the Afghan government fall? Will they remain? We don't know. So China is quite aware of this and are hedging. Now, secondly, the Chinese are trying to develop multilateral and bilateral institutions to essentially fill the vacuum left by the United States. So they've entered into a strategic agreement with Tehran, so Iran, based on sharing of military technology. But again, the hope is to use multilateral institutions like the SCO to bring peace, or at least conduct a peacekeeping operation should the need arise. And lastly, and I need to move on because I'm running out of time, but lastly, China is also using Afghanistan, or trying to bring Afghanistan closer to its orbit to balance against India. okay? Because the thing with the rivalry between China and India is China sees India as a problem or a challenger maybe a few decades from now, so 30 to 50 years from now. So what they're trying to do now is they are bringing or dangling really lucrative infrastructure projects in front of Afghanistan, perhaps expanding CPEC, so the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to include Afghanistan, to bring the country out of India's orbit, rather. Now, this is a good way to springboard to India then. Oops, I did something. Yeah, so this is a good time to springboard to India, okay? And what does India have to gain in Afghanistan? Well, essentially, India has a lot really to gain in terms of, I guess, friendly or having a very pro-India government in Afghanistan. Now, a large part of this is down to the Pakistan question, right? So everyone's aware of India and Pakistan's rivalry. And I mean, this is pretty much eternal, this rivalry. And Afghanistan offers India perhaps an opportunity to upset the balance of power, okay? So having and really maintaining a pro-India government, a strong pro-India government in Afghanistan, is a way for Pakistan to be encircled or contained, really. Now, they've done this to a certain extent, and indeed the current government in Kabul is very pro-India and very anti-Pakistan. But again, this remains to be seen, you know, going into the future. But another reason why, or another, I guess, gain that that India might realize from Afghanistan is to break out of its region. Because one of the things about Indian foreign policy is to really recognize that it is both dominant in its region, in its neighborhood, but also it's a prisoner of it, which means that India is the biggest country in South Asia in everything that matters. So population, military, economics, all of that. But they're also stuck there, and it's very difficult for them to break out. So Afghanistan, a pro-India government in Afghanistan, offers them a potential opportunity to springboard into Central Asia and to gain access to resources in Central Asia, such as the natural gas fields of Turkmenistan. Cool. Hang on, there's a chat going on. Oops. Right. So moving on. Cool. So one other thing worth mentioning about India, or I guess the second last thing worth mentioning about India, is the cultural cooperation and the soft power considerations. So one thing to get with the Modi government is that they are championing this notion of a civilizational power, okay? So if we think about the great powers of the world, China, US, Russia, even India, Iran, Europe, whatever that is, all of these countries promote their own brand, their own foreign policy vis-a-vis some civilization back in history, okay? So the Modi government has been attempting to put this at the forefront of their foreign policy. And because Afghanistan shares a common history, being the center of Vedic culture, so when Vedic culture emerged, being a center of Buddhism historically, being, I guess, the jumping off point for the Mughal Empire, all of this deeply connects Afghanistan to India. Okay, so the Indian government is using this these historical connections to really promote this, or I guess to bring India closer to, to bring Afghanistan rather closer to India's orbit. Now, one other thing worth mentioning too is, well, if India is so determined to have a pro-India government in Afghanistan, why haven't they taken more active steps? Well, I guess the thing to realize is that India has always been at the forefront of major developments in, post-2001 Afghanistan, okay? They have been there since the Bonn Conference. They've been there every step of the way, building democratic institutions. But the thing about India is they don't, in terms of their brand, they don't really want to be in the spotlight, okay? So there's been a less visible role. Now, maybe let's fast forward to today. It's a bit more difficult because the Trump administration has been trying to step back from Afghanistan, and they've been quietly pushing India to take a more active role. So what this means in reality is India is caught between a rock and a hard place, whereas on the one hand, they want to keep this brand, okay? They keep building democratic institutions and adopting a soft power approach. But on the other hand, the US has been pressuring them to take a more active military role, either through transferring military aid, such as helicopters, planes, and so on and so forth, or actually getting involved in terms of security apparatus in the country itself. So the last thing I want to say about India then, this kind of gets back to this notion of Afghanistan as a cause, is one of the common features, and I guess the main thing that India is hoping to gain from Afghanistan is a real test case for what's known as the New Delhi or Mumbai consensus. So, I mean, we've heard about the Washington consensus, so with neoliberalism, we've heard about the Beijing consensus with no string attached, win-win development, but we don't really hear about the Mumbai consensus or New Delhi consensus, do we? But basically what this means is, or what this is reflective of rather, is India's own unique approach to development, one that focuses more on the people, okay? So whereas the US is more of cultivating democracy and democratic institutions, China is more focused on economics, India is focused on people, okay? And this is why India has been reluctant to take a more military and visible role, because their goal here is, yes, of course, to establish a pro-India government and maintain a pro-India government in Afghanistan, but also to establish and maintain a pro-India population in Afghanistan. So India has been heavily funding capacity building programs in terms of resources, in terms of tech, in terms of government. All of these things are designed to impose India's unique brand on development in Afghanistan. So the last thing, just to kind of conclude, because I've been kind of shouting a lot of information at you guys, but I hope that you have a good idea about the situation now. If I was going to narrow down a few takeaways from the session and really the role of Afghanistan going forward, I wouldn't really want to give you anything definitive, but more to highlight a few questions going forward, okay? Or a few issues or debates really going forward. Now, the clearest thing is that all the major regional powers are focused on Afghanistan, okay? Russia is heavily involved now, India is involved, Pakistan is involved, China is involved, the US is involved, Iran's involved. All of these countries have a part to play or want to play a part moving forward. But the big question mark is what future relations between the Taliban and Afghan government will look like. Because if the Taliban, if they rip up the peace agreement that they had with the United States and take over the country after the US withdraws, then that's it for India, okay? Because the Taliban are more linked with Pakistan. If the US remains or continues a presence in Afghanistan, then this will obviously dictate China's involvement in the country, because China can get less involved or cannot get as involved, rather, if the US is there. So I think with this in mind, the bigger question to ask is if a stable Afghanistan is going to help or hinder these rising powers' ambitions. Is there more of an interest or more of a stake in maintaining an insecure or unstable Afghanistan? Or is it in the best interest of regional powers to maintain a strong Afghanistan? So thank you very much, and I will take some questions now, if there are any.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I don't see any questions, just someone was writing in chat that this is a really interesting and thorough analysis of the situation in the region. So they really enjoyed it and found it very, very exciting. And we can also see now this as an example of how these kind of subjects are taught at University of Westminster. Which was initially the purpose of today's session. Maybe we should also connect Richard and or you can tell us what kind of courses and subjects are taught in the Faculty of International Relations and Politics. So what is the choice for the students who are considering this kind of study areas?
Sure, sure. Myself or Richard?
Oh, Greg, please, you go ahead. You've got much more of
Okay, yeah, sure, I'll do it.
Whoever
Why not?
is,
Why not? Okay, cool. So it depends on undergrad or postgrad, right? So for undergraduate, we have a variety of programs. I mean, there's IR in politics. That's what I teach on. There's just straight IR. There's IR in development. And then there's just straight politics itself. So there's a lot of different courses, a lot of different interests. Predominantly, we try and make the course as eclectic as possible. So rather than just focusing, so say you take international relations and development, you will have core modules that focus on development, but we really emphasize on you branching out, okay? And learning about maybe surveillance, okay? Something that I teach, maybe ethics and philosophy, maybe journalism, all of these things. So it's difficult to kind of narrow down, you know, what we exactly teach as a department. We do teach international relations and politics on the EU, on Asia, on Latin America, on Africa, but we also try and get our students to branch out as much as possible and to learn different courses or different modules from other departments.
And what kind of career perspectives have the students after they graduate from one of those courses?
I mean, I can only really speak for students that I've taught in the past, but there's a wide range. I mean, some have gone into government. There's a lot of international students, so a lot of the international students will go back and then they'll work for their government. Some have become journalists. Sasha was here before, but I don't know where she's gone. But she's working, I think,
to connect her.
Oh, darn. Well, she does. I think she works in the tech sector in Uzbekistan now. So yeah, there's a broad variety, but basically the idea is that, you know, with politics and IR, this is a step forward for you to take many different branches. Okay, so you can work in development like I did initially, or you can go into academia, or you can go into government, or you can go into journalism. You know, there's limitless potential. And indeed, one other thing that I want to mention about the university is that we've been really prioritizing employability, okay, and developing skills. Partly this is because the UK is going through a recession, but also to make our graduates, I guess, to open more doors really for our graduates in terms of career paths that they want to pursue. Okay.
So then I will, I guess, ask Richard as well to share the information about the entry requirements for universities and all the admission procedures, deadlines, and so on, just that we have that as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Anastasia. Yeah, so for entry requirements for students, the majority of students who are following Russian high school qualifications will go through a foundation year before joining us for bachelor's programs. And we have a dedicated foundation year we run with a partner of ours, which students can join and then get guaranteed progression as long as they meet their grades, coming to the first year of international relations or politics programs at Westminster. We also accept students directly if they're coming through the A-level or IB or an international school background. All applications to the university would come through the UCAS application system, and the team at Insight Lingua can help with any applications you're making and give you advice. There's also university open days you can join if you want to find out more, and perhaps about a wider breadth of courses as well. There's one coming up on the 28th of November, which is available to log into online and find out a little bit more information about the university that way. And it's a fantastic opportunity to do a tour of the campus, a virtual tour of the campus, and see where you'll be studying.
And for master's applications, you do accept the degrees from Russian universities, right?
We do, yes. We accept the degrees directly from Russian universities. There's a range of entry requirements. It's equivalent usually of a British 2-2 degree. So we accept people who've studied a bachelor's degree or specialist diploma in Russia. All of the entry requirements are on our website. We have a dedicated page for Russia where there's some great testimonials from students of ours as well.
Okay. Yeah, I also have to say that when it was possible to travel before, we used to welcome representatives of Westminster University in Moscow or in St. Petersburg regularly. Now, when we can't travel, we can always organize meetings with them online. So we can do student interviews and check if your application is good enough to be accepted, and do some pre-screening and advice, and possibly even give an offer if everything works fine.
Of course, yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah. So we are a little bit over the time, I'm afraid. So yeah, but thank you very much again. It was really very interesting, and I hope more people will also see it on YouTube after we finish the streaming, because it will be saved in our YouTube channel. And yeah, we'll see you next time for our next seminar then.
Great. All right.
Thank
Well,
you
thanks
very
for having
much.
me.
Thank you.